There is a moment just before sleep when someone says your name and for half a second you do not know who they mean. You have felt this. A voice calls out in a hallway or in a dream or in the last soft seconds before the eyes close. And there is a flicker, a blank, a kind of gentle nowhere before the name lands on you again and you answer to it, the way you always do, the way you have done 10,000 times before. That flicker is not a malfunction. It is a doorway. And tonight, if you are willing, we are going to walk through it together, slowly, the way you might walk into a dark garden you already know by heart. You do not have to understand anything to be here. You do not have to follow every word. Let your eyes rest closed if they are not already. Let the day, whatever it held, begin to set down its bags at the door. There is nowhere else you are meant to be right now, and nothing here that asks anything of you. If you are listening from a bed that is not quite big enough, or a room that is too warm or too cold, or too quiet or too loud, that is all right. That is exactly where this begins. If you have found your way here tonight through the sleepy monk, thank you for letting this be the last voice of your day. Let us begin. Take one slow breath now, if you like. Not a special breath, just the next one, allowed to be a little longer than it needed to be. Let the shoulders come down from wherever they have been living all day, up near the ears, tight around some old worry. Nothing to fix, nothing to solve tonight. Only this, a voice, a dark room, and a question that has followed human beings around for longer than any of us have been alive. Who are you really? You do not need any particular belief to be here tonight, and you do not need to have thought about a single one of these old ideas before. Some of what follows may sound like something you already quietly knew. Some of it may simply pass through and settle somewhere you cannot quite name. Either is entirely fine. There is no test at the end of this, no correct way to listen. If your mind drifts, let it drift. It will find its way back, or it will not. And either way, you will still have rested. If you would like to notice, just for a moment, where you are listening from tonight, which room, which bed, which quiet corner of your evening, you are welcome to. And if you would rather not notice anything at all, that is welcome too. It is a strange question to ask a tired mind at the end of a long day. And yet, it is, in its own quiet way, one of the gentlest questions there is. Because underneath, it is a kind of permission. If the answer is not fixed, if it never was, then you do not have to hold the whole weight of yourself upright for one more hour before you are allowed to rest. You can set some of it down. We will pick up nothing tonight that we cannot also put back down. Let us explore a story about this, because stories are how the old teachings have always traveled, quietly from one tired person to another, across a very long time. In a small village at the edge of a wide valley, there lived a woman known to everyone simply as the weaver. She had been the weaver so long that the villagers could not remember a time when the loom in her front room was not clattering softly through the afternoons, threads rising and falling under her hands like something breathing. Children were taught to say her title before her name, the way children are taught such things. The weaver will mend it. Ask the weaver. The weaver knows. One evening, an old traveler passed through, the kind of traveler who seems to belong to every road and no particular home, and he asked to trade a night's shelter for a story. The weaver gave him a bowl of something warm and a corner by the fire, and in the morning, before he left, he asked her a single question. Not about her cloth, not about her craft. He asked, "Who are you when the loom is empty?" She laughed at first, the way we laugh when a question catches us somewhere soft. "I am the weaver," she said. "That is who I am. Ask anyone in this village. And when your hands are too old to work the thread," the traveler said, not unkindly, "who will you be then?" She had no answer. She had never once, in all her years at the loom, asked herself the question in reverse. She had built her whole sense of herself the way she built her cloth, thread over thread, day after day, until the pattern was so familiar she mistook it for her face. The traveler did not wait for an answer. He simply thanked her for the fire and the bowl and continued on down the road, the way old travelers in these stories always seem to. For a long while after he left, the weaver sat at her loom without touching it. She noticed, for what may have been the first time, that she was noticing that there was something in her that watched her weave, that had always watched her weave, long before it had a name like the weaver hung around its shoulders. It had watched her as a child too, before there was any loom at all. It had watched her sleep and wake and grieve and laugh, and none of those had a title either. This is what the story is pointing toward, gently, without insisting. The roles we wear are real and useful and often good. The weaver's cloth kept people warm. Her title gave her a place in the village, a way to be needed, a way to belong. There is nothing wrong with being the weaver or the parent, or the one who always answers the phone when trouble calls, or the one who holds the family together at the holiday table. These roles are not lies, but they are not the whole of you, any more than a coat is the whole of the body that wears it. Somewhere underneath every role you have ever worn, the good ones and the heavy ones both, There has been a quiet watcher, unnamed, simply present, who was there before the role began and will still be there, however softly, after it ends. You do not have to figure this out tonight. You do not have to decide right now who you are underneath the coat you have been wearing. It is enough for tonight only to notice that the coat is not stitched to your skin. It can be set down at the door, the way you might set down a bag after a long day of carrying it. And you will still be entirely, fully yourself, standing there in the quiet, without it. Let us pause here for a moment. Let your breath find its own rhythm again, without any help from you. Notice the weight of your body where it rests, against the mattress, the pillow, the blanket pulled up close. There is nothing to do with this noticing. Only let it happen, the way water settles on its own once you stop stirring it. When you are ready, we will go on together. The old teachers had a way of asking this question that was almost playful, though it never felt like a trick. There is a small story, sometimes told in the mountain monasteries, about a young student who came to an old teacher full of urgency, the way the young often do. "Teacher," she said, "I have been trying for months to find out who I really am. I have thought about my childhood, my name, my family, my work. I cannot find the answer." The old teacher, who was mending a torn sleeve by the window, did not look up right away. When she finally spoke, she asked only one question in return. "Who is it that is looking?" The student opened her mouth to answer and found, to her surprise, that there was nothing readily there. Not because she was foolish, and not because the question was a puzzle with a clever solution hidden somewhere. It was because the question pointed back at the very thing doing the asking, the way a flashlight cannot shine on itself. She sat with the teacher in silence for the rest of the afternoon, and neither of them spoke again about the matter. And yet, something in the student had already begun, quietly, to loosen. This is not a question with an answer written somewhere on a scroll, waiting to be found if only you look hard enough. It is closer to an invitation to notice what is already noticing. You do not have to solve it tonight. And truthfully, you were never going to solve it the way you solve a chore or a task on a list. It is not that kind of question. It is more like the moon. You do not capture it. You simply notice it is there, quietly, whether you are looking at it or not. Carry this with you tonight, if it helps, though there is no obligation to carry anything at all. The next time you catch yourself introducing yourself, silently or out loud, by a title, the tired one, the busy one, the one who always has to be strong, you might, only if you like, add a small, silent pause after it. Not to argue with the title, only to notice that something in you noticed it being said. Let your shoulders soften again now. Let your jaw unclench. just slightly, the way it does sometimes, without your permission, when you finally stop gripping the day. There is nothing required of you here. When you are ready, we will continue. There is another way the old teachings have circled this question, and it has to do with water. Because water has always been patient enough to teach people things that words alone cannot. Picture, if you like, a river. Not a particular river, not one you could find on a map, but simply a river. The kind that runs through the back of so many old stories, wide and unhurried, carrying the light of the sky on its surface. Now imagine standing at its bank each morning for 100 mornings in a row and calling it by the same name each time. The river, your river. And each morning, without exception, every single drop of water that made up the river the day before has already gone on ahead, out to some sea you will never see, and been replaced by entirely new water, arriving from somewhere upstream you have never visited. Is it the same river? In the way that matters to us, yes, of course. You would recognize its bend, its sound, the particular way the light falls on it at dusk. And yet, not one drop of it has stayed the same. The river is not a fixed thing that happens to move. The river is the moving, given a name so we can point to it and love it and return to its bank each evening. This is closer, the old teachers said, to what a person actually is than the fixed statue we quietly imagine ourselves to be. You are not a photograph, printed once and framed. You are closer to the river, continuous, recognizable, dearly loved, and made new in every single moment, with almost nothing about you, cell or thought or feeling, remaining exactly as it was even 1 year ago. The child you were is not lost. The child you were flowed into the person lying here now, the way upstream water flows into the wide part of the river without ever disappearing, only changing shape. There is a small story that sits well beside this one, about two old friends who met once a year at the same bend in a river to fish and talk, as they had done since they were young. One year, one of the friends arrived looking heavier with worry than the other had ever seen him. "I am not who I used to be," he said, sitting down on the same rock he always sat on. "I have failed at things. I have changed in ways I do not like. I do not know how to face you as the man you remember." The other friend was quiet for a while, watching the water. "Do you remember," he finally said, "the summer we were boys, and we swore this river would never change, and we carved our initials into that tree, so it would always look the same?" He gestured toward an old tree on the bank, its bark grown thick and strange around the letters, barely legible now, swallowed slowly by the tree's own growth. "The tree kept growing," he said. "It did not stay a boy's tree to please us, and it is more beautiful now than it was then." though it is nothing like it was. His friend said nothing, but something in his face loosened, the way a held breath finally lets go. We so often mistake change in ourselves for a kind of failure, as though the self we had last year was the true one, and every version since is a departure, a falling off, a debt still owed. But the river was never asked to defend its water. It was only asked to keep moving, keep reflecting the sky, keep carving its bank a little differently each season. You have changed in ways you did not choose, and ways you did. Some of that change you grieve. Some of it quietly, without ever telling anyone, you are proud of. All of it is still you. The way every stretch of the river is still the river, from its first trickle in the mountains to the wide mouth where it finally meets the sea. You do not have to hold yourself to the shape you were 5 years ago or even 5 minutes ago. You are allowed to keep moving. That is not a loss of self. In its own quiet way, it is the truest thing a self can do. Let us rest here again for a moment. Feel the mattress beneath you, holding you up the way a riverbank holds water, without strain, without asking anything in return. Let the breath come and go on its own. There is nowhere to be but here, in this moving, changing, entirely welcome body of yours. When you are ready, we will go on. There is a question that sits close beside this river question, and it has to do with the body, because so often, without quite meaning to, we mistake the body for the whole of who we are. Think for a moment, gently, without alarm, of how strange it is that the body you have now, not the body you were born with, not one cell of it, most likely, has stayed exactly the same since you were small. And yet, through all of that quiet replacing, something in you has continued to say, I, with the same steady confidence a child says it, pointing to its own chest. The hand that pointed then is not the hand you have now, but the pointing, the sense of being someone who can point, that has never once left. There is an old story told in different ways in different villages about a craftsman. Some say a potter, some say a boat builder, who was famous for a particular boat he had built as a young man. It had carried fishermen safely through 50 years of storms, and everyone in the village called it by his name. The way a well-loved thing is sometimes given the maker's name instead of its own. Over the years, planks rotted and were replaced one by one, a little each season, until at last, a curious traveler passing through asked the old man, now bent and grey, whether the boat tied at the dock was truly the same boat he had built half a century before. The old man considered this for a long moment, the way people in these stories tend to consider things without rushing toward an answer. Every plank has been replaced, he said. So in one sense, no, not a single piece remains from that first year. And yet, it is still the boat that has carried this village safely for 50 years. It is still the boat I built. Both things are true at once, and I have stopped needing to choose between them. This is very close to what is true of you. The body lying here now is not, in any strict sense, the body of the child you once were, and yet it has carried the same you through every one of its changes, the way the boat carried the same purpose through every replaced plank. You do not need to choose between "I have changed completely" and "I am still entirely myself." Both are true. You are allowed to hold both without contradiction, the way the old boat builder finally did. Somewhere in his very long life, there is a second, smaller story that often travels alongside this one, about a young girl who once asked her grandmother, watching her hands work dough for bread, whether the grandmother felt sad that her hands were not the young hands she remembered from the girl's own mother's stories. The grandmother laughed softly, the kind of laugh that has nothing sharp in it. "My hands have kneaded 40,000 loaves of bread," she said, "each one a little different from the last. I am not sad my hands have changed. I am glad they have had so much bread to make." There is something in this small exchange worth carrying tonight, if you like. The changes in your body, the ones you notice with tenderness, and even the ones you notice with a small ache, are not proof that something original and better has been lost. They are more like the marks on the grandmother's hands, evidence not of decline, but of use, of a life that has actually been lived rather than merely preserved behind glass. You do not have to love every change all at once, tonight or ever. It is enough only to notice that beneath every change your body has gone through, something has stayed quietly present through all of it. Not unchanged exactly, but continuous, the way the river was continuous, the way the boat was continuous, and that this presence has never once depended on the body staying the same to remain fully, unmistakably you. Let the breath settle again now. Let your hands, wherever they are resting, simply rest without needing to hold anything, not even themselves. There is nothing to figure out about the body tonight. It has already been carrying you faithfully all day without complaint, and it is allowed now only to rest. When you are ready, we will go on together. Sometimes the question of who we are gets tangled, quite understandably, with the question of who others think we are. This is one of the heaviest coats a person can wear, and one of the easiest to mistake for skin. There is a story told about a young man who left his village to study under a well-known old master, hoping more than anything to be seen by her as talented, as promising, as someone worth teaching. He worked with a kind of desperate diligence, watching her face after every task for some sign of approval, some small nod that would tell him he was, at last, becoming who he was meant to be. But the old master rarely gave such signs. She corrected his form without praise and let his errors sit uncommented, and the young man grew quietly miserable, convinced he was failing at something he could not name. One evening, exhausted, he finally asked her directly, "Do you think I am talented? Do the other students speak well of me? I need to know what I am in your eyes and in theirs." The old master set down her tea and looked at him for a long moment. "You have been asking the wrong people," she said. "You have been asking me and the other students, and the shape of your father's disappointment from 3 villages away, who you are. None of us can answer that. We can only tell you who you are to us today in this weather, based on what little we have seen. That is not nothing, but it was never going to be enough." The young man did not understand this fully that night. The story tells us, nor for some years after. But it stayed with him the way certain sentences do, returning at odd hours, a little clearer each time. Slowly, he began to notice how much of his sense of himself had been built entirely out of other people's glances. A teacher's silence, a rival's praise, a parent's old disapproval, still echoing years after the parent had gone. None of it was false exactly, but none of it, taken alone or even taken all together, had ever been the whole truth of him. There is a second story that often accompanies this one, about 2 rivals who had competed since childhood over who could carve the finer bowl, the straighter arrow, the taller tower of stones. Each measured himself endlessly against the other, and neither ever felt quite at peace, because peace, built this way, always depends on someone else standing slightly lower. One autumn, one of the 2 men fell ill and could not work for a long season. He expected, lying there, to feel diminished. Surely his rival was pulling ahead, becoming, in the eyes of the village, the better craftsman, the truer self. Instead, in the stillness of his illness, with no bowls to carve and no one to measure himself against, he found something unexpected. A quiet, a version of himself that had nothing to do with winning or losing, that had simply been there, breathing, watching the light move across the ceiling each day, entirely whole without a single comparison in sight. When he recovered, he still enjoyed his craft, and still, in his own quiet way, appreciated a well-made bowl. But something in him no longer needed his rival to lose in order for him to feel like himself. You are allowed, tonight, to set down the mirror you have been holding up to other people's opinions of you. Not because their opinions do not matter at all. They may, in their place, in daylight, when there is something useful to be done with them. But at night, in the dark, with no one watching and nothing to prove, you do not need a single other person's glance to confirm that you exist or that you are enough. You already are. The way the river is a river, even on the nights no one walks along its bank to admire it. Let us pause again gently. Let the dark room around you simply be dark, without needing to be understood or explained. Let the small sounds outside, a car somewhere far off, the settling of the house, the wind if there is wind, pass through without needing your attention. Nothing out there requires anything of you right now. When you are ready, we will continue. There is one more kind of quote worth naming tonight, and it is perhaps the oldest one of all, the quote made not of what other people think of us now, but of what we were told very early, before we had any way to question it. There is a story about a young elephant tied by a thin rope to a small stake in the ground. As a calf, she pulled and pulled against it and could not break free. And so, over time, she learned, quite reasonably, given what she knew then, that the rope could not be broken. She stopped pulling. Years later, fully grown, strong enough to uproot the very stake and the ground around it without any real effort, she still did not pull. Not because the rope had grown stronger, because a young part of her, formed long before her strength was, had never been told the story had changed. This story is often told about elephants, but it was never really about elephants at all. Each of us has carried, since childhood, a few thin ropes tied by people who may have meant well or may not have. A sentence overheard, a label given too early, a role assigned before we were old enough to refuse it. You are the difficult one. You are the quiet one. You are not the kind of person who finishes things. These sentences, spoken once, sometimes decades ago, by someone who has likely long since forgotten saying them, can sit quietly at the center of how a grown person still understands themselves. The rope long outlived by the strength that could snap it in an instant. If only it remembered to try. There is a smaller story that often follows this one, gentler in its shape. A woman, well into her later years, finally returned to painting after nearly 40 years away from it, having been told as a girl, offhandedly, by an aunt who likely meant nothing cruel by it, that she was not the artistic one in the family. She had believed this so completely for so long that it had simply become a fact about her, the way one's height is a fact or one's birthplace. When her granddaughter finally handed her a brush one rainy afternoon, half as a joke, she painted something soft and uneven and entirely her own. And she wept a little, not from sorrow, but from something closer to recognition. The rope, it turned out, had been slack the whole time. She had simply never tested it. You do not need to identify tonight every rope you may still be carrying. That is work for a different kind of hour, wide awake, with warm light and steady hands. Tonight, it is enough only to notice gently that some of the sentences you have quietly believed about yourself for a very long time were never facts. They were only things once said by someone who did not, could not have known the whole of you, and that you are, even now, lying here free to test the rope whenever you are ready, and not one moment before. Carry this with you tonight if you like. The next time an old, familiar sentence about who you are rises up on its own, the tired one, the not good enough one, the one who always ruins things, you might simply notice that it arrived, the way weather arrives, without needing to obey it. Let the breath soften once more. Let the weight of the blanket remind you gently that you are held even now, even here, without needing to have earned it. When you are ready, we will go on together. There is a particular kind of loneliness that sometimes visits people who are searching for who they really are, and it deserves to be named kindly, because it is often mistaken for evidence that the search has gone wrong. There is a story about a hermit who lived for many years high in the mountains, having left the village below to search in solitude for his own true nature, away from every voice and every role that had once defined him. For a long while, the solitude felt like clarity. No one calling him son or husband or failure or friend, only the wind and the rock and his own breath day after day. And yet, some years in, a strange heaviness began to settle over him, one he had not expected. He had shed every role and found underneath them not the shining, clear self he had hoped for, but something that felt, at times, unbearably alone. One winter, a traveling merchant lost her way in a storm and found shelter briefly in the hermit's small stone hut. They spoke for only a single night of small things, the weather, the merchant's route, an old song she remembered from her childhood. And in the morning, she was gone, back down the mountain, never to be seen by him again. And yet, the hermit noticed something curious in the days that followed. He felt, for the first time in a long while, entirely himself. Not because he had finally found some pure self in isolation, but because, for one evening, in the presence of another person, without needing to perform any role at all, he had simply been met. This is a teaching easy to miss if you are searching only inward. The self is not something found purely alone, sealed off from everyone, like a coin buried and dug up later, unchanged. It is also found, and often most clearly found, in the quality of presence between two people. A night by a fire, a hand held without needing to explain why, a friend who asks nothing of you but your company. Solitude has its place and its gifts, and this very hour, alone in the dark with only a voice for company, is itself a kind of solitude, and a good one. But it is not the whole of the path. You do not have to earn your way to some pure, isolated self, cut off from everyone who has ever loved you before you are allowed to feel whole. There is a second story smaller, that sits well beside this one, of two strangers seated beside each other on a long night journey. A road that would once have been walked in the old telling rather than traveled by any faster means. Neither spoke for the first hour. Then one, watching the dark countryside pass, said quietly, almost to herself, "I have been trying for years to figure out who I am without anyone else's help." The other, a stranger she would likely never see again, replied gently, without any need to be wise about it, "Maybe you were never meant to do it without anyone else's help. Maybe that is not the failure you think it is." They did not speak again that night. But something in the first woman settled, the way water settles when it is finally allowed to stop being stirred. You are allowed, tonight, to be someone who is found partly in the company of others, and not only in the quiet of your own mind. This is not a lesser kind of self-knowledge. It may, in its own way, be the truest kind there is. The self, not as a locked room you must enter alone, but as something that becomes clearer, again and again, in the warmth of being genuinely met, even briefly, even by strangers, even tonight, by nothing more than a voice keeping you gentle company in the dark. Let us rest again for a moment here. You are not alone in this room, not really, not in the way that matters. You are held by the same old questions that have kept every tired human being company at the end of every long day, back through more centuries than anyone has counted. Let your breath come easily. When you are ready, we will continue. There is one more thread worth pulling gently before we begin to gather everything together, and it has to do with the watcher itself. The quiet presence that has been noticing everything we have spoken of so far, without ever once being named directly. Think of the sky for a moment. Not a particular sky, but simply the sky. The way it sits above every village and every mountain and every wide valley in every one of these stories. Weather moves through it constantly, storms and clear afternoons and long grey weeks of rain and the particular gold light that comes just before evening. The weather is dramatic. The weather is what everyone talks about, what everyone remembers a season by. And yet, the sky itself, underneath all of that weather, has never once been touched by it. It does not become a storm when a storm passes through. It simply holds the storm, briefly, the way a room holds a guest, and lets it move on. There is an old story about a young monk who came to his teacher in great distress, describing a storm of grief that had moved through him after a difficult loss. Anger, sorrow, confusion, each arriving and departing in turns, none of them staying long, all of them exhausting. "I do not know who I am anymore," he said. "Some days I am furious. Some days I cannot stop weeping. I feel as though I am nothing but weather, with no sky left underneath it. The teacher listened for a long while before answering. Tell me, she finally said, who is it that has been noticing all this weather come and go? The young monk paused. It was, of course, the same question the student had been asked in the earlier story, but arriving now from a different angle, the way a returning image often does in a story like this one, deepened this time by everything that had come before it. He had been so consumed by naming each storm, grief, then anger, then a strange numb quiet, that he had never once thought to notice the constant, steady presence underneath all of it, watching each storm arrive and pass and give way to the next. You are not the weather, the teacher said gently. You never were. You are the sky the weather moves through. And the sky, however dark the storm, is never actually harmed by it. This is, perhaps, as close as any of these old stories come to answering the question we began with tonight. You are not the anger that visited you last week, nor the grief that visited the week before, nor the small joy that may visit tomorrow morning without any warning at all. You are not even the titles we spoke of earlier: the weaver, the parent, the tired one, the one others expect you to be. All of these are weather, real weather, weather worth feeling fully without pushing it away before its season is done. But weather, all the same, moving through something steadier, something that has never once in your entire life been swept away by even the fiercest storm you have ever weathered. You do not have to find the sky tonight. You do not have to search for it the way you might search for a lost object under a bed. It is not lost. It has been here the entire time, holding every single feeling you have ever had, without needing to become any of them. It is, quite simply, what is listening to these words right now. Carry this with you tonight, gently, without any pressure to remember the exact words. Whatever weather passes through you tomorrow, or the day after, or the difficult week after that, you might, if it helps, quietly recall that you have never once been the storm. You have only ever been the sky it passed through, wide enough and old enough to hold it. Let the breath settle once more. Let the body sink a little further into the mattress, the way weather finally settles after a long day of moving. There is nowhere else to be. When you are ready, we will gather everything together, gently, before we let you go. There is another thread worth following before we gather everything together, and it has to do with the name you were given, long before you had any say in the matter. A name is a strange thing when you look at it closely enough. It arrived before you could speak, chosen by people who loved you or hoped to, based on a grandmother they missed, or a sound they liked, or a meaning in some old language most of us have long forgotten. And from that day on, it followed you everywhere, called across kitchens, written on envelopes, spoken gently at bedsides, spoken sharply in moments of trouble, worn so long and so completely that it can feel, by now, indistinguishable from your own skin. There is a story about a young boy who was given at birth a name that meant, in the old language of his village, quiet river. He grew up hearing it said with such tenderness by his mother and such disappointment by his father, who had wanted a name that meant something closer to strong or victorious, that the boy came to feel he was somehow failing simply by being himself. He was, in fact, a quiet child, thoughtful and slow to anger, and he spent much of his boyhood believing this was a flaw written into him by the very sound of his own name. It was not until he was a grown man, long after his father had passed, that an old aunt, visiting for a season, told him something he had never known. His mother had chosen that name not because she expected him to be quiet, but because she herself, as a girl, had loved sitting by a quiet river near her childhood home, and had wanted her son's name to carry, always, a small piece of the peace she had felt there. The name had never been a judgment on who he should become. It had been a wish, offered before she even knew his face, for exactly the kind of peace he had, in fact, grown into. He wept a little, hearing this not from sorrow, but from something closer to being met very late by a love that had been there all along, simply misunderstood. There is a second, smaller story that often accompanies this one, of a woman who disliked her own name for most of her life, finding it plain, old-fashioned, unlike the name she would have chosen for herself. In her later years, cleaning out an old chest, she found a letter her grandmother had written just before she died, explaining that the name had belonged to a great aunt who had, in a difficult season generations back, taken in and raised 3 children who were not her own, asking nothing in return. The woman had carried that name for 60 years without knowing it carried, quietly, an entire life of unglamorous kindness folded inside it. You do not need tonight to go searching for the hidden meaning behind your own name, though you may find, if you ever do, that it holds more tenderness than you expected. This is not really about names at all. It is about the deeper truth the stories are circling. So much of what you believe about yourself arrived before you had any way to question it, wrapped in someone else's hopes, someone else's grief, someone else's history, long before you were old enough to add your own chapter to it. None of that was ever the whole of you. It was only ever the first page, written by someone else's hand, in a book that has always, quietly, belonged entirely to you to keep writing. Let us pause here again, gently. Let the sound of your own name, if it drifts through your mind right now, simply be a sound, familiar, dear, but not a cage. Let the breath come easily, without needing to be arranged just right. When you are ready, we will go on. There is one more kind of self-worth naming tonight, and it is perhaps the hardest to see clearly because it is not made of memory or role or name at all. It is the self that exists only in this exact moment, unburdened by yesterday and untroubled by tomorrow. The self that has, in truth, never once left the present, no matter how far the mind has wandered from it. There is a story about an old ferryman who spent his whole life carrying travelers across a wide river back and forth from one bank to the other, more times than anyone could count. Travelers would often talk to him during the crossing, telling him their worries, their plans, their long accounts of who they had been and who they hoped to become. The ferryman listened kindly to all of it and offered little in return beyond the steady rhythm of his oar. And yet travelers often left the boat feeling strangely lighter, as though something in his stillness had rubbed off on them during the short crossing. One day, a scholar, known throughout the region for his many years of study into questions of the self, boarded the ferry and, recognizing something unusual in the old man's quiet, asked him directly what wisdom had made him so at peace. The ferryman only smiled and pointed to the water moving past the boat. "I have crossed this river more times than I can count," he said, "and not once has the water been the same water twice. And not once, in all those crossings, have I needed it to be. I'm only ever here, on this crossing, with this passenger, in this weather. Yesterday's crossing is not asking anything of me. Tomorrow's crossing has not yet arrived to ask anything either." The scholar sat with this for the rest of the journey, saying nothing further. And when he stepped off the boat on the far bank, something in him had grown quieter than it had been in many years of careful study. There is a smaller story that often travels beside this one, about a musician who had spent decades worrying before every performance whether this particular evening's playing would be as good as some remembered evening from years before, or as good as some imagined future evening not yet arrived. One night, exhausted by the weight of comparing every present moment to a past or future that did not exist in the room with her, she simply stopped. She played that evening without measuring it against anything at all. Not her younger self, not her hoped-for future self, only the notes in front of her, one at a time. It was, audience members said afterward, the finest they had ever heard her play. She herself said only that it was the first time in years she had actually been present for her own music. You do not have to solve the whole of your life tonight, nor account for every version of yourself you have ever been, nor plan carefully for every version you might someday become. You only have to be here, now, in this dark room with this breath, the way the old ferryman was only ever on this crossing, with this passenger, in this particular weather. That is not a small thing. It may, in fact, be the closest any of us ever come to simply being ourselves, entirely, without effort. Carry this with you tonight, gently. Whatever tomorrow asks of you, it has not asked yet. Whatever yesterday held, It does not need defending right now. There is only this crossing, this breath, this quiet room, and you, entirely and sufficiently present within it. Let the body settle further now, heavier against the mattress than it was even a few minutes ago. Let the mind, if it is still turning over some small thought, simply let it turn, without needing to follow it all the way to its end. There is no crossing waiting for you tonight, but this one. No far bank to reach, no schedule to keep. Only the water moving past, unhurried, and you resting easily in the boat. When you are ready, we will begin, gently, to gather everything together. There is a quieter kind of mask worth naming too. Before we gather everything together, not the mask of a title or a role, but the one so many people wear simply to keep others comfortable. There is a story about a young innkeeper who had learned from a very early age to read the mood of every room she entered and shape herself to fit it. Cheerful for the traveler who needed cheer, solemn for the one grieving, brisk and efficient for the one in a hurry. She had grown so skilled at this that she rarely, if ever, asked herself what mood she herself was actually in. It was easier, she found, to simply become whatever was needed. Her inn was known for many years as the warmest in the region, and she was loved by nearly everyone who passed through it. And yet, some nights, after the last guest had gone to bed, she would sit alone by the dying fire and feel a strange hollowness she could not name, as though she had spent the whole day being everyone except herself. One winter, an old woman staying several nights at the inn noticed this hollowness in her, the way old women in these stories so often notice what others miss. On the third evening, instead of asking for tea or a blanket, she asked the innkeeper a different question. "And how are you tonight?" Not how the room needs you to be. How are you truly? The innkeeper opened her mouth to give her usual bright answer and found, to her own surprise, that she did not have one ready. She sat down across from the old woman for the first time in longer than she could remember, and simply told the truth, that she was tired and a little lonely and unsure some days who she even was, underneath all the shaping she did for everyone else. The old woman did not try to fix this. She only listened the whole evening, nodding now and then, letting the innkeeper's own true voice, unshaped by anyone else's need, fill the quiet room for what may have been the first time in years. There is a smaller story that often sits beside this one, about a father who had spent so many years being strong for his children, steady through every illness, calm through every fear, never once letting them see him uncertain, that he had nearly forgotten, by the time they were grown, what his own uncertainty even felt like. It was only in a quiet conversation with his own grown daughter many years later, when she gently asked him what he had been afraid of all those years, that he found himself weeping for the first time in her presence, and discovered, to his relief, that she did not love him any less for it. If anything, she said, she felt she was finally meeting him. You are allowed tonight to set down the shape you hold yourself into for the comfort of others. Not because their comfort does not matter, it often does. And kindness shaped this way is not a lie, only a gift, freely given. But underneath every shape you have ever offered someone else, there has always been a truer, quieter version of you, unshaped, unhurried, asking for nothing more than to be occasionally let out into the light, even if only here, tonight, in the safety of this dark and private room, where no one is asking you to be anything at all. Let us pause here again. Let your face, wherever it has been holding some old practiced expression, simply soften into whatever it actually wants to be right now, even if that is nothing in particular. There is no one here to shape yourself for tonight, no room to read, no mood to match. Only the dark and the breath and whatever quiet, unshaped version of you happens to be present in this exact moment. Let it be seen, even if only by you. When you are ready, we will go on. There is one more shape worth speaking of gently tonight, and it has to do with the way loss can seem, at first, to take a piece of ourselves away entirely, when in truth, it is only ever changing the shape we hold it in. There is a story about a gardener who had tended, for many years, alongside her husband, a small garden behind their home, his hands for the heavier work, hers for the delicate pruning, the two of them moving through the seasons together, so long that neither could quite remember after a while whose idea any particular flower bed had originally been. When he died, in the autumn of a year like any other, she found she could not bring herself to walk into the garden for many months. It felt, she told a neighbor, as though half of herself had been buried along with him, and she did not know who she was anymore without the other half of the hands that had made that garden what it was. It was her granddaughter, visiting the following spring, who finally coaxed her back outside, not with words, but simply by kneeling in the dirt herself and beginning, clumsily, to weed a bed that had gone wild through the long winter of neglect. The old woman watched from the doorway for a long while before she finally came out and knelt down beside her and began, almost without deciding to show her granddaughter which shoots were flowers and which were only weeds pretending to be flowers, the way her husband had once shown her, decades before. She did not stop grieving that day, nor for a long while after. But she noticed, kneeling there in the dirt beside her granddaughter's clumsy, eager hands, that something of her husband's steadiness had not disappeared along with him. It had settled into her own hands instead, the way water settles into new ground after the old riverbed has shifted. She was not the same gardener she had been before his death, but she was not simply half a gardener either. She had become, without meaning to, a fuller one, carrying now both of their hands in her own. This is, perhaps, the gentlest thing the old teachings say about loss, and it deserves to be said softly, because grief is not something to be rushed past, even here, even now. The people we have loved and lost do not take pieces of us away with them when they go. In their own quiet way, they leave something behind instead, folded into how we move through the world afterward, a way of noticing light, a particular kindness, a steadiness of hand, so that who we are keeps changing shape around the love we have known, without ever losing what made that love real in the first place. You do not have to resolve any grief you carry tonight, old or new, large or small. It is allowed to simply be here with you, in this dark room, unrushed. It is not evidence that something is broken in you. It is only, in its own quiet way, proof of how fully you were once, and still are, capable of love. Let the breath come and go once more, without needing to be steady or brave about it. Let whatever softness has risen in you rise, without needing to be hidden even from yourself. There is nothing to tend to tonight, no garden waiting for your hands, only rest, and whatever quiet love still lives inside you, warm and unhurried, exactly where it has always been. When you are ready, we will begin gently to bring everything together. There is a small, old teaching about time itself worth sitting with tonight, because so much of the trouble we have with knowing ourselves comes from trying to hold every version of us all at once in the same tired hand. There is a story about an orchard keeper who planted a long row of trees the year his first child was born, meaning to watch them grow together, tree and child, season by season. In the early years, he would grow frustrated some spring that a particular tree had not yet borne fruit the way its neighbor had, as though the trees were somehow in a race with one another, as though the slower one were failing at being a tree. An old friend, walking the orchard with him one afternoon, finally asked him gently why he expected every tree to be at the same stage in the same year, when each had been planted from a different seed, in slightly different soil, catching slightly different light. The orchard keeper had no good answer. He had simply never thought to ask the question. From that day, he began walking the orchard differently, not comparing tree to tree, season to season, but simply asking each tree in its own time what it needed to become fully itself. Some trees bore fruit early and generously. Others took many quiet years before their first blossom. None of them, he came to see, were behind. They were each exactly as old as they were, doing exactly what a tree of that age does. There is a second story that sits well beside this, about two brothers raised in the same house, one of whom found his path early, a trade, a marriage, a settled life by his mid-20s, while the other wandered for decades, trying and abandoning one calling after another, watched with growing worry by the whole village, who had long ago decided he was the lost one, the disappointment, the tree that had failed to bear fruit on schedule. It was not until he was well into his 50s that he finally found the work that had all along been waiting for him. A quiet craft involving old broken things made whole again. And he did it for the remaining decades of his life, with a devotion and a joy that his settled brother, for all his early success, admitted he had never quite felt in his own more orderly path. Neither brother's life was the correct one. They were simply two different trees, planted in the same season, growing at their own honest pace. You are not behind. You have never been behind, no matter what the village of your own mind sometimes tells you late at night. Comparing this year's version of yourself to some earlier year or to some other person's tidier timeline. You are exactly as old as you are, having lived exactly the life you have lived, and there is no clock running against you tonight in this dark room, no schedule you have failed to keep. You are only ever, at any given moment, precisely as far along as a person who has lived precisely your life would be. That is not a small thing to be. It is the only thing anyone has ever actually been. Let us pause here for a moment, gently. Let the years behind you simply be years, neither wasted nor rushed, each one having done exactly what it needed to do to bring you here, to this bed, this breath, this quiet hour. There is no other tree to measure yourself against tonight, no faster season to catch up to. Only your own roots, in your own soil, doing exactly what they need to do. When you are ready, we will go on. There is one final image worth sitting with before we gather everything together, and it has to do with striving itself, with the particular, familiar tiredness of a mind that has spent a whole lifetime trying to become someone, rather than simply resting in who is already here. There is a story about a potter who spent 40 years trying to make the perfect bowl, a bowl so balanced, so true in its curve, so honest in its glaze, that it would finally satisfy the restless part of him that had never once, in 4 decades of skilled work, felt entirely at peace with anything he had made. Each bowl he finished, he set carefully on a high shelf and immediately began imagining the next one, the one that would finally be enough. His shelves filled over the years with hundreds of beautiful bowls, each admired by everyone who saw them. And still, he woke each morning with the same quiet dissatisfaction, certain that the true bowl, the one that would finally let him rest, was still somewhere ahead of him, still to be made. In his old age, his hands no longer steady enough for the wheel, he sat one evening surrounded by his life's work, all those shelves of bowls catching the last of the evening light. And for the first time, he simply looked at them without reaching for the next unmade one in his mind. He noticed, as though for the first time, how much quiet skill had gone into even the earliest, roughest bowls from his youth. He noticed that not one of them, examined honestly, had ever actually been lacking. The lack, he understood then, slowly, had never lived in the bowls. It had lived only in the restless part of him that could never quite stop reaching for the next one. He wept a little that evening, not from regret, but from something closer to relief. The same relief the weaver felt in the very first story tonight, sitting at her loom without touching it. 40 years of striving toward a perfect self that was always, always one step further ahead, when the self doing all that striving had, in fact, been whole and worthy the entire time. In every single bowl, in every single year. There is a second, much smaller story that fits neatly beside this one, of a young apprentice who once asked the same potter decades earlier when he would finally know he had become a true craftsman. The potter, young himself at the time, had laughed and said he did not know, that perhaps no one ever fully knows. It was only much later, near the very end of his life, that he understood the truer answer and wished he had known it to give the boy all those years before. You do not become a true craftsman on some final day when the last bowl is perfect. You are a true craftsman the whole time, in every bowl, including the rough ones, including the ones you throw away. The becoming and the being were never two separate things. They were the same clay, turning the whole time on the very same wheel. You do not have to finish becoming anyone tonight or any night. You are not a bowl still waiting on the wheel for some final perfect shape before you're allowed to be worthy of the shelf. You have been worthy the entire time, through every rough year and every smooth one, and the restless reaching that sometimes keeps you from feeling. This is not a flaw in you. It is only weather again, passing through the sky that you have always, quietly, already been. Let the body settle further now, heavier against the mattress with each slow breath. Let the reaching, if it is still there somewhere, simply loosen its grip. The way a hand finally opens after holding something tightly for far too long. There is no next bowl to shape tonight, no final version of yourself still waiting on the wheel. There is only this shape, right now, exactly as it is, and it is enough. When you are ready, we will begin gently to bring everything together. There is a fear, quiet and rarely spoken aloud, that sometimes hides underneath this whole question, and it deserves a gentle word tonight before we go any further. If you are not the coat, and not the rivers passing water, and not even the weather that moves through you, some small part of the mind may wonder, will I disappear? If none of these things are truly me, is there anything left at all? There is a story about a lamplighter who walked the same narrow streets each evening, lighting one lantern after another along his route, and who worried in his younger years that when the last lantern of the night was lit, something in him would be finished, empty, without purpose until the next evening came. One night, an old woman sitting on her step watched him light the lantern outside her home and asked him what he did with himself in the hours after his work was done. "I am not sure," he admitted. "I feel as though I disappear a little once the lanterns are lit, as though the lighting is the only part of me that is truly here." The old woman smiled and pointed up at the lantern he had just lit, still glowing steadily on its post. "Does the light disappear?" she asked, "once your hand is no longer touching the wick?" He considered this. Of course it did not. The light continued on its own, long after his hand had moved to the next lantern, long after he had gone home to sleep, burning quietly through the night without needing him to keep tending it every moment. "You are worried," the old woman said, "that you are only the lighting. But perhaps you are more like the light itself, steady, continuing, present even when no one is watching you, even when you yourself are not watching yourself. You do not stop existing simply because your attention has moved elsewhere." This is, perhaps, the gentlest reassurance the old teachings offer to this particular fear. Setting down the coats, the titles, the old robes, the weather does not empty you out. It does not leave a hole where a person used to be. What is left when everything borrowed and everything passing has been gently set aside is not nothing. It is the steady light itself, quieter than the coats, harder to point to than a title, but no less real, no less present, no less entirely and fully you. There is a smaller story that sits well beside this one, about a child who was afraid of the dark, convinced that when the lamp in her room was blown out each night, the room itself and everything in it simply ceased to exist until morning. Her grandmother, sitting with her one night, blew out the lamp and asked the child to reach out her hand and touch the bedpost beside her. "Is it still there?" the grandmother asked, "even though you cannot see it?" The child, feeling the familiar wood under her fingers, admitted that it was. "You are like the bedpost," the grandmother said. "The dark does not undo you. It only means you cannot currently be seen, but you are still entirely here, exactly as solid, exactly as real, whether the lamp is lit or not. You are not disappearing tonight by setting down the coats you have worn all day. You are only, finally, allowing yourself to be felt rather than seen. Solid, steady, present, The way the bedpost remains exactly itself in the dark. The way the lantern's light continues quietly on its post, long after the lamplighter's hand has moved on to the next street. Let us pause here once more. Let the darkness of the room around you simply hold you, the way it held the child's bedpost, without taking anything away from you at all. Let the breath continue on its own, steady, quiet, entirely present, exactly as it has been the whole night through. When you are ready, we will go on. There is one last small figure worth visiting before we gather everything together, and she is, in her own quiet way, the simplest of all tonight's company. A child, the one you once were, still living somewhere close beneath every other version of you that has come since. There is a story about a woman well along in years who had grown so accustomed to being capable, responsible, the one others leaned on, that she had nearly forgotten there was ever a version of herself who did not have to hold anything together at all. One afternoon, cleaning out an old drawer, she found a small, worn drawing she had made as a girl. Nothing remarkable, just a lopsided sun and a house with too many windows. And something in her chest loosened unexpectedly at the sight of it. She sat on the floor for a long while, holding the paper, remembering faintly what it had felt like to draw simply because drawing felt good, with no thought at all for whether the sun looked correct or the house made sense. She realized, sitting there, that the capable woman she had become had never actually replaced that child. The child was still there, underneath all the years, all the responsibilities, all the roles so carefully built on top of her. A little quieter now, a little less often invited into the room, but not gone. Never gone. Only waiting patiently, the way an old friend waits for an afternoon like this one, when someone finally thought to open the right drawer. There is a smaller story that fits beside this one, about a father who, watching his own son play some simple, joyful game in the garden one evening, felt a sudden, surprising ache of recognition. Not sadness exactly, but a kind of tenderness for a version of himself he had not visited in decades. He did not join the game that evening, but he watched it a little longer than he usually might have, and something in him quietly felt less alone. You do not have to go looking tonight for the child you once were, though you may find, if you ever do, that she or he is not nearly as far away as you assumed. It is enough, for now, only to know that nothing in you has ever truly been lost. No matter how many roles have been layered carefully on top of it over the years, the child is still there. The weaver's watcher is still there. The sky beneath every storm of weather is still there. You have never once in your whole life actually gone anywhere. Let the breath settle, softer now, slower now, the way a child's breath settles into sleep without any effort at all. Let the whole day and every year behind it simply rest now, held gently, needing nothing further from you. When you are ready, we will begin at last to bring everything together. There is one more shape of confusion worth naming gently before we gather everything together. And it lives in the small, common habit of mistaking being needed for being known. There is a story about a young woman who moved in her 20s from the small village where she had grown up to a larger town some days' journey away, hoping to become someone new, someone chosen freely rather than simply inherited by circumstance. In her old village, she had been the miller's daughter, useful for her steady hands and her patience with numbers. And she had come to resent how entirely her worth there seemed tied to what she could do for others. In the new town, she worked hard to be indispensable in a different way, the one who always said yes, the one who could be relied upon for any task at any hour without complaint. For a time, this felt like freedom. She was wanted everywhere. Her days were full. And yet, some years in, she noticed a familiar hollowness creeping back, not unlike the one she had left the village to escape. She had simply built a new version of the same trap, worth measured entirely by usefulness, belonging earned fresh each day through what she could provide, never once resting easy in the plain fact of simply being present. It was an old innkeeper in that town, watching her rush from task to task one particularly full evening, who finally asked her to sit down just for a moment and have nothing to do at all. She resisted at first, the way people often resist rest when they have built their whole sense of self on motion. But she sat, and in the quiet that followed, the old innkeeper asked her a small, plain question. If you could do nothing useful for anyone in this town for one entire week, do you believe anyone here would still want you close? The young woman opened her mouth to answer quickly, out of habit, and found, to her own surprise, that she did not actually know. She had never once tested it. She had spent so many years making herself needed that she had never given anyone the chance to simply want her for nothing, the way you might want an old friend's company on a quiet evening with no task between you at all. She did, eventually, test it, falling ill for a short stretch that winter, unable to help with anything at all, and found, with some astonishment, that the same people who had relied on her for years came by anyway, not for what she could do, but simply to sit with her, to bring her tea, to ask how she was feeling, entirely apart from her usefulness. It was, she said later, one of the more disorienting weeks of her life, and also one of the most tender. There is a second, smaller story that sits well beside this one, about two old friends, one of whom had spent her whole life being the dependable one in every friendship she kept. certain that the moment she stopped being useful, she would be quietly replaced. On her friend's birthday one year, exhausted and unable to organize the usual gathering she always arranged, she sent only a short note apologizing for her absence. To her surprise, her friend showed up at her door that same evening instead, saying simply, "I did not come here for a party. I came because I wanted to see you." It was a small moment, easily missed, and yet it undid, quietly, years of a belief she had never once thought to question. You are allowed, tonight, to be more than what you provide. Being needed has its own real value, and there is nothing wrong with a life built partly around usefulness, around care given freely to others. But it was never meant to be the entire foundation beneath your sense of who you are. Somewhere underneath every task you have ever completed for someone else, there has always been a version of you worth wanting for no reason at all. The same steady presence the weaver found beneath her loom. The same watcher who noticed the storms come and go beneath the wide, patient sky. Carry this with you gently if it helps. You do not have to earn your place in a room by what you can offer it. You are allowed some evenings simply to sit down with nothing to give and still belong exactly where you are. Let the breath settle once more, unhurried, needing nothing further from you tonight. Let your hands, wherever they rest, be still, without needing to reach for one more task before sleep is finally allowed to arrive. There is no room to be useful to tonight, no gathering to arrange. Only this quiet bed and a place in it that was always simply yours. When you are ready, we will begin at last to bring everything together. There is one more small teaching worth sitting with tonight before we let everything settle. And it has to do with a particular kind of pond and a particular kind of stillness. There is a story about a young monk who was troubled deeply by his inability to answer the question his teacher had set him. To say plainly in one sentence who he truly was. Every answer he offered felt false the moment it left his mouth. "I am a monk," he said, and immediately thought of all the years before he wore the robe. "I am kind," he said, and immediately remembered moments of cruelty he was not proud of. "I am a seeker of truth," he said, and felt, even as he said it, the small vanity hiding inside the words. Each answer collapsed under its own weight before it was even fully spoken, and he grew more and more frustrated, certain that everyone else in the monastery had found their answer, and he alone remained lost. His teacher, watching this frustration build over many weeks, finally took him one morning to a small pond at the edge of the monastery grounds. Its surface stirred and muddy from a recent storm. "Tell me," the teacher said, "what do you see in the water?" "Nothing," The young monk said, "It is too stirred up to reflect anything clearly." They sat together on the bank in silence, doing nothing at all for what felt to the young monk like a very long while. Slowly, without either of them touching it, the mud settled and the surface grew calm, and the sky above began to appear in it, clear and whole, exactly as it was. The pond did not have to work to reflect the sky, the teacher finally said. It only had to stop stirring itself up long enough to let it happen. Every answer you have given me these past weeks has been another stirring of the water, another attempt to force an image before the mud has even settled. Perhaps the truest answer to who you are is not a sentence to be found by trying harder. Perhaps it is simply what appears on its own once you finally stop trying to force it. The young monk did not fully understand this that morning, the story tells us, and did not fully understand it for some time after. But something in him, sitting by that quiet pond, loosened its grip just slightly, the way a hand loosens after being told, gently, that it has been holding something far too tightly for far too long. There is a smaller story that fits well beside this one, about a woman who spent years journaling every night, trying to write her way to a clear, final understanding of who she was, filling notebook after notebook with careful, effortful sentences that never quite satisfied her. One evening, exhausted, she simply sat with the blank page instead of filling it, pen resting untouched in her hand, doing nothing at all for the better part of an hour. She wrote nothing that night. And yet she said, afterward, that it was the closest she had ever come, in all those years of careful writing, to actually feeling like herself. You do not have to find the sentence tonight, the one clean, final answer to who you really are. You may never find it in the way the mind likes to find things, captured, defined, filed neatly away. And this is not a failure. It may, in its own quiet way, be exactly as it should be. Some things are not meant to be captured in a sentence. They are only meant to be settled into, the way the pond settles, the way this whole night has been settling around you, a little more with every passing minute, whether you have found the right words for it or not. Let us pause here, gently, one last time, before we gather everything together. Let your own mind, if it has been stirring, simply be allowed to settle, the way the pond settled, without effort, without force. Only time and stillness doing the quiet work that trying so rarely can. When you are ready, we will begin. We have walked a long way together tonight, through a village with a loom in it, and a river with a boat tied to its bank, and a mountain hut where a hermit learned that solitude was never quite the whole answer, and a wide, patient sky holding storm after storm without ever once being torn apart by any of them. None of these were separate lessons, not really. They were the same single teaching. Turn gently in the light, the way you might turn a stone in your hand to see how it catches differently from each angle. There is one final story that gathers the threads together, and it is a small one, almost too small to notice, which is often how the truest stories arrive. In a quiet town, there lived an old woman who had, over the course of her long life, been a daughter, a wife, a mother, a widow, a healer of small injuries, a keeper of a garden that fed half the street, and, in her very last years, simply an old woman who sat most afternoons on a bench near the well, watching people pass. She had worn every one of these roles fully, without regret, and set each one down in its turn, as her life required it. The way a traveler sets down one bag to pick up another at each stage of a long journey. She never once, in all those years, seemed troubled by the changing. A young girl, curious the way children often are about the very old, once asked her, sitting beside her on the bench, "Who are you really, now that you are none of those things anymore? Not a wife, not a mother in the busy way you once were, not even much of a gardener these days." The old woman smiled, the way people in these old stories often do at exactly this kind of question, and did not answer right away. She simply pointed, without a word, to the well across the small square, the same well, the girl would later learn, that had stood in that spot for longer than anyone in the town could remember, drawing water for one generation after another, each with their own names, their own roles, their own small storms of grief and joy, all of them long since passed on. The well had never once asked to be anyone in particular. It had simply remained, quietly, exactly where it was, offering whatever it had to whoever came to it, in every single season. "I am like the well," the old woman finally said. "I have given water in 100 different shapes to 100 different needs over a very long life. But I was never any single one of those shapes. I was only ever what gives, underneath all of them, however it is asked for." Then she laughed softly and added, "I did not know how to say that when I was young. It has taken me the whole of my life to be able to say it this simply. This is what every story tonight has been quietly circling from the very first line, without ever once needing to say it outright. You are not the coat, though you have worn many good ones. You are not the river's water from any particular year, though every year of it was real and dear and fully yours. You are not the boat's planks, though the boat has carried you faithfully your whole life. You are not what others think of you, nor the old rope tied by someone who did not know your full strength. You are not even the weather, however fierce it has sometimes been. You are not only the name you were given before you could speak for yourself, though it may carry more tenderness folded inside it than you have ever known. You are not only this single crossing of the river, though this crossing too is fully and entirely yours while it lasts. You are not only the shape you hold yourself into for the comfort of others, kind as that shaping so often is. You are not only what loss has taken, nor only what it has, in its quiet way, left behind in your hands. You are not behind any other tree in the orchard, and you were never only a bowl still waiting on the wheel for someone else's idea of finished. You do not disappear when no one is watching, and you were never only useful, you were always, underneath every task you have ever completed for someone else, simply and sufficiently wanted. You are the well. You are the sky. You are the quiet, steady presence that has been holding every single version of yourself you have ever been, without ever once needing to become any one of them permanently. And you have always, already been enough, exactly as you are, long before this question was ever asked, and long after you have forgotten it was asked at all. None of these images were ever meant to compete with one another, or to be sorted into some final, correct answer you must choose among before you are allowed to rest. The loom, the river, the boat, the sky, the well, the lantern, the orchard, the bedpost in the dark, they are all simply different hands reaching toward the same quiet truth. The way different travelers arriving at a mountain from different roads all eventually find themselves standing at the very same summit, however differently each of their paths began. You do not need to remember which story went with which image. You only need to let the feeling underneath all of them settle into you. The way warmth settles into a cold room once the fire has finally been allowed to catch. You do not have to remember any of this by morning. None of it needs to be carried consciously into tomorrow, the way you might carry a note in your pocket. It has already settled in you, the way water settles once it is finally allowed to be still, and it will still be there, quietly, whether you remember these particular words or not. There is nothing left to do tonight, nothing to solve, nothing to become, nowhere further to travel. Let the questions rest now, the way the old woman's well rests quietly overnight, waiting for no one in particular, needed by no one in this exact moment. Simply present, simply itself. If a small worry rises up once more in these last few minutes, some last errand of the mind trying to matter one more time before it is allowed to rest, you do not have to chase it away. You can simply let it pass through. The way weather passes through an old, patient sky, watched without alarm, released without effort. It does not need you to solve it tonight. Tomorrow will still be there to hold whatever small part of it is actually yours to carry. And tonight is not tomorrow. Tonight is only this: the dark, the breath, the quiet weight of the body finally allowed to stop holding itself up. Notice, if you can, without straining to notice anything at all, how much of you may already be halfway towards sleep. Even now, even before the rest of you catches up. The muscles around the eyes have likely already begun to let go. The jaw has likely already softened. Somewhere in these last few minutes, without you deciding it should. Sleep has probably already begun its slow, quiet arrival. The way evening begins long before the sky is fully dark, gathering gently at the edges before it settles all the way in. You do not have to help it along. You only have to stop gently getting in its way. Feel the weight of your body, fully given over now to the bed beneath you. Feel the breath, slower now than when we began, moving in and out entirely on its own, the way it has done every single night of your life, without ever once needing your permission. Let your hands unclench wherever they are resting. Let your face soften, the small muscles around the eyes, the jaw, releasing whatever they were quietly holding. There is nothing more required of you. You have done enough today. You have always, in fact, been enough. We have walked a long way together tonight, through the weaver's quiet loom, and the old friend's river, and the boat that kept its purpose through 50 years of replaced planks, and the hermit's mountain, and the old woman's well. You do not have to hold on to a single one of these images to carry what they were pointing toward. They have already done their work, the way a good story always does, quietly, underneath the part of you that is listening. Let go now, gently, of the need to be anyone in particular. Let go of the coat and the title and the old rope, and even this voice, softly, as sleep begins to move in closer. There is nowhere further to travel tonight. There is only this, the dark room, the slow breath, the steady, nameless presence that has been here the entire time. Underneath every question, underneath every story, underneath even this very sentence, waiting patiently as it always has, for you to simply rest. Sleep well. Thank you truly for spending this quiet hour with the sleepy monk. Rest now. You are already and have always been exactly who you are.